Martin Reeves. Welcome to our series of conversations with leaders in business and the arts and in science about the question of beauty and business. It may sound like a strange conjunction of words, but I think it's very appropriate at a time when business and society issues are in question. And I'm very pleased to be joined for this conversation by Paulo Pisano, who is the Chief People Officer of Bookings.com, and also a citizen of the globe. I believe you have connections to Italy, Argentina, Brazil, now Holland. And you're a qualified somatic and ontological coach, so maybe we can get into that a little bit later. So welcome, Paulo.
Thanks, great to be here.
So I have 7 unusual questions for you. I guess the first one is, we're at the House of Beautiful Business, a very unique venue. What aspiration or expectation brings you here?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've been in the field of human development and kind of the human side of business for a very long time. Right, that was my choice some 20 years ago. So I'm very much in love with anything that has to do with how people organize together to get great things done. And when I think about the house, I think it really kind of, for me, evokes that notion of not forgetting that behind kind of every business you have humans trying to do things, and humans in all their kind of complexity. For me, it's not as much an aspiration that I have, because for me the notion of aspiration connects a lot with the energy we already have in the business, plenty of it, right? Aspiration, accomplishment. For me, it's, if anything, kind of almost the opposite. It's almost no aspiration. It's kind of breaking away from that energy on my day-to-day and coming in to be inspired by different kinds of conversations, to be to connect with, make meaningful connections with individuals that might not have come across.
Certainly a great place for that.
Absolutely. And then actually from that, maybe something new comes back at my day-to-day work, so to speak, right? But the notion here is almost like less doing and less aiming for, and just being in the flow and connecting with it.
So if we can get very dark on a question of a common human concern right now, we have this existential threat of climate change, and in spite of all of the sincerity and the declarations and the goals and the intergovernmental conferences, so far the trajectory of emissions and temperature rise hasn't changed at all. And from a humanistic perspective, what's missing from the picture, do you think? What's the missing ingredient?
I think when you think about big issues like climate change, I think one of the issues, maybe it's not the only one, but is that you have different people think different things of it. They have different opinions on what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, when it needs to be done. And the challenge there, I think it's fundamentally a challenge of coordination, is that people are kind of rowing in somewhat different directions, and it's been very hard for us to figure out as a society.
The stakeholders all have different interests and perspectives.
Yeah.
And so if you had a magic wand, because we can believe in magic at the House of Beautiful Business, and you were able to, practicalities aside and constraints aside, you could add one ingredient to the situation, you could change the situation in one way, what ingredient would you add?
I'll say this carefully, because the ingredient I would add is urgency. I wouldn't want to add urgency through catastrophe, if you know what I mean, if I could avoid that, right? But there's a difference if you look at how we've reacted to the COVID crisis. There was a clear sense of urgency because it was happening next to us. It was right around us. With climate change, it doesn't happen this way. Yes, you may see things happening around the world, and even like the most scientifically minded people might say, was this really because of climate change, or is it just a one-off, or whatever it is? It doesn't affect you in the same way with the same urgency. If there was a way to, with a magic wand, up the urgency quite significantly, I think our creativity would really get kind of...
I guess that must connect with your job in the sense that, I'm not sure we did agree, but people have a propensity not to change until they really need to. And so creating that sense of urgency is like a key aspect of change management. How do you create a sense of urgency before catastrophe?
Yeah, I mean, you point to that old adage of necessity is the mother of all invention, right? So where's the necessity, right? How do we make that necessity kind of obvious for people? I think a lot of what we're doing, the notion of awareness and education is part of it. although one would argue education takes time, it takes a long time, I do think though we have the channels, we have the means, we have the technology, we have the inclination to make that growth of momentum on awareness go quite, I think, significantly more quickly. So I'd say part of the way to do that is like when you do change in companies, right? Sometimes you come in to do change in an organization. Intellectually, people want to make the change. But the urgency, the burning platform, so to speak, is not there. So what do? You manufacture the burning platform. You don't manufacture it by inventing it, but by understanding, by listening deeply to what's happening around the organization and where are either the yearns that will motivate people to move towards something or the fears that will help them move kind of away from something, and then you build a narrative around that. We've seen people around the world trying to do more of that. I think we need more of it, but I think we need more alignment also in that narrative.
So let's move on to our central question, which I guess has to do with the yearning side of the equation you just talked about, which is the house of beautiful business, beauty and business. Those are words that don't often go together. So can business be beautiful? Should it be? And is it, do you think?
So I have maybe two angles on this. So one, I would say, the short one, I would say business is by definition beautiful for me, because business, you don't do business with yourself, right? Business assumes you are interacting with somebody else, with another party, right? Business is about connecting needs and desires or wants with offers, with a service, with a product. So business,
fundamentally, it's a beautiful human propensity.
Absolutely. And if you think business long term, and if you think business with awareness that we are kind of in a closed system, then it also invites long-term thinking. It invites sustainability. It invites the building of trust, the building of connections that will outlast the transaction that you're making at that moment. So I think there's a side of business which I think is intrinsically beautiful. The other thing that comes to mind is that old adage of, kind of beauty in the eye of the beholder, right? And beauty in the eye of the beholder for me is not as much just that people have, different people will find different things beautiful, but it's the notion of agency, the notion that when I think of beauty in the eye of the beholder, it evokes to me beauty as a verb, as an action. So I think the act of striving to make business beautiful breaks you away from the autopilot, breaks you away from the purely transactional nature that might be there in the business to think about what else is possible.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually. I think Tim Lebrecht, the founder of the House of Beautiful Business, has a marvelous way of putting together words that don't belong to create new meanings. And so the theme of this house is concrete love. So an idea and a practice. And it's interesting you say beauty is a verb. You do beautiful things. We don't often think about it as an action. But if we look at business as it is today with all of its warts and imperfections, what specifically could be more beautiful?
I think we were talking about this in the previous question around this notion of listening, right? The part of the coordination problem that we have is a problem, in my opinion, first and foremost, of listening. We're more interested or connected with what we want to do and what we believe than in really scanning around us and getting a deeper understanding of what's happening and where are the opportunities to connect and to help and to support. First and foremost, I think we're missing an element of listening more deeply around us.
That's interesting, because I'm a biologist, and in systems science, if you have an uncrowded system, you can focus on the agent. You can not necessarily need to listen as much. You can do your stuff. But once the context starts to become really important, you have to think about the relationship between you and the context. So in a way, the planetary temperature is our context. And we're on a crowded planet. We have to listen more to what the other agents need and what we collectively need. Is that the sense of what you mean?
Absolutely right. It's that notion of to optimize the system, you have to sub-optimize the parts of the system. But in order to you to even be capable of sub-optimizing your parts, so to speak, for the greater good, you need to understand what is that greater system, and you need to understand what is your part in the system, what are the other parts in the system. Unless you are curious and you're connecting with it and you're listening and you're asking, you don't know that.
Yeah, the hardest skill, listening. So let's go into connecting a little bit. So one connection we need to make is with the future. And I think you have children, right?
Yes.
And so if you think about the planet that your children are going to live on, what would you wish for them most?
That's a hard one. It's a lot of stuff, right?
But if you would boil it down to like one essential thing, what is it that the property, the desirable property or the essential property of their future that you'd wish for?
An essential property for me is compassion. I think if we can have more compassion around the world, compassion meaning amongst other things, kind of a deep sense of connection and being kind of in the same place as other people, that unequivocal sense of interdependency, of connection, of sameness in a way, I think that makes a huge difference. If I could maybe use that magic wand from before into focusing on that, I would kind of really focus it on compassion if it was one thing that I focus on.
Have you discussed the future with your kids? You know,
we talk.
Tell me about that conversation. What is their perspective on the future of the planet?
Yeah, they're at that age group where there's 7 and 9 where they're starting to learn kind of through school also about sustainability, about the future of the planet, about some of the challenges that we have. So there's a lot of questions flowing around that. And for me, it's always amazing that, and we were talking about this before, how we learn sometimes much more from our kids that we think they learn from us, right? And for me, there's something just around the straightforwardness and the simplicity in a good way of how children up to a certain age, prior to us kind of starting to screw it up with education and in the educational system, but just cutting through the complexity and saying, well, why don't we just do this? Or why don't we do that? And of course, then as a parent, I go, well, that's not that simple because of this, and then I catch myself having become a native to the complexity around us. And
so that connection you talk about seems to me pretty important because climate change is a collective problem, right? If I reduce my emissions but increase yours by, for instance, using more energy-intensive materials, we haven't really made any progress. And so in a way we have to connect, we have to see the big common picture. But at this particular time we see increasing divisions between nations, decoupling. We see increasing divisions between people, social polarization. It sort of comes back to one of your first comments. How do we listen? How do we connect? How do we emphasize and amplify connection?
So from a societal standpoint, I would argue education is probably the most important lever we have to pull. Although it is a slow lever to pull at and it takes time, I would argue it's the most sustainable tool we have to kind of increase awareness, expectations, provide skills and perspectives that will have people connect, etc. But if I think from a more individualistic standpoint, there are, from my kind of work as a coach over the years, there's a number of perspectives, particularly in the field of coaching, but not only, where the problem starts with oneself, right? If you are not capable of listening to you, of being in tune, for example, with your body,
yes,
what's happening with you, what's happening with your emotions, how what you think connects with what you feel, and how that connects with how you embody your experience, then it's very hard for you to do that at a macro level. So there's a perspective that by helping people understand how to do that better, then it will naturally flow into how they interact with the world.
So that's a perfect segue to my last question. It's almost like we rehearsed. Philosophers would say that we act as we think and we think as we speak. And it's interesting if you look at the language of business that there are certain words that you'll almost never find in an annual report or an investor call. And we've already mentioned two of them, beauty and love, concrete love, the theme of the conference. So my question for you is a little bit of a strange one, which is, if you were to pick a single word that is not used very much in business, but you think should be, maybe beauty, maybe love, maybe something else entirely, what would that word be, and what would happen if we were to use that word more?
I couldn't help but smile when you said we act as we think, right? As the son of a clinical psychologist, I've learned that you don't necessarily act as you think, right? You act moved by a lot of unconscious kind of processes and desires and things behind you. So if I follow on that vein, I think there's something around self-awareness, consciousness might be maybe the word, that, if we are driving towards being more conscious of our actions, owning our actions, conscious of the impact that what I do has on what you do, to your point on the, interdependency, conscious of my environment, conscious of the different levels in the system. If I'm more conscious, I think you can have if a business operates more consciously, there may be very different results. So maybe I haven't read all the reports out there, but I would imagine the word consciousness.
And if we use that word more,
is
how would that make business and the world a better place? What would that lead to, do you think?
For me, it evokes two things. It evokes intention and, in a way, accountability, right? Is that you are accountable for your actions, for the impact you have on the world. I think I still hear a very strong narrative in businesses, almost like what you hear with kids or whatever, where he or she made me do it, right? Oh, that's the system. We have to operate. We have to provide a certain return to our shareholders. We have to do this. Well, you don't have to. You're making a choice. And you make trade-offs, right? I go back to the way in which we dealt with COVID, right? The way in which we've been dealing with COVID meant huge trade-offs, had huge costs, but we still did it, and we're doing it. Why? Because we think it's worthwhile. Now, if any one person or a business is not doing something, is because they don't think it's worthwhile. So there's something around that notion of consciousness.
That's interesting. So in a way, you're saying consciousness is accountability not for goals imposed by others, but accountability for one's actual actions, a more natural and maybe more encompassing form of accountability.
It's ownership, yeah.
Ownership, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your interesting perspectives with us, Paulo. But I must ask you one more question, which is, sure. I'd love to understand what an ontological and a somatic coach is. In the final minutes, could you share with us what that is?
Yeah, I mean, coaching has many different, there's an origin for a lot of the coaching that we see these days in, maybe the 70s. But, and actually, interestingly enough, a lot of the coaching, ontological coaching in particular stems from the work of biologists. From Chile, Humberto Maturana, Francisco Varela, and a number of individuals who were working with autopoiesis and a number of things on how systems interact. But the notion of ontological coaching is this notion of how when you're helping individuals or systems to change or to improve, it's not about looking at different actions that an individual can make, but it's actually looking at the individuals themselves. So you break the loop by, rather than not getting a result and then changing your action to get a different result, in being stuck in that loop, you go back into who is the observer that I am, how am I, and how do I shift that so new actions that seemed impossible start coming into the realm of possibility, right? That's a super bastardized summary of ontological coach. And somatic coaching is about the body, is about us as integral beings, where a lot of our narrative or thoughts or emotions, they live in our body, like it or not. We embody those, and therefore you work through the body to access opportunities for change and for development.
Well, it's been a great conversation. It gives me hope that humanism is alive and kicking in business. It was great talking to you, Paulo. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Martin. Pleasure.